So with me today, I have Brett Davis, who's the Principal and General Manager of ConvergeHEALTH by Deloitte, Harmony Garges, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Beef Healthcare, which is a joint venture between GSK, Pfizer, and Shionogi, and Anne Hetherington, who's the Senior Vice President and the Head of Data Sciences of the Head of Data Sciences Institute with Research and Development at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Thank you all for joining me today. It's good to have you. I'm going to start by asking you why everyone is so excited about real world evidence and why it matters so much and why it can make such a difference in pharmaceuticals. Let's start with Brett. What's your experience of it and what are your thoughts on the subject?
Sure. Thanks for having me and thanks for leading such an important discussion. I think a lot of people are excited about real world evidence because it really promises to answer what I like to call the hard questions in healthcare. What works, for whom, why, in what context, and at what cost. And the promise of that is very alluring. Now, of course, the challenge is that this data is produced in uncontrolled settings, unlike a clinical trial. So there are numerous regulatory challenges, scientific challenges, data science challenges involved with real world data. But I think the promise of it, remains super important. At Deloitte, we recognize this and have been conducting an annual benchmarking survey for the last 3+ years, the most recent of which we just published actually right as the pandemic was hitting. And that survey confirms that this is top of mind for the C-suite across the life sciences industry, as well as with regulators. In fact, over the 3 years that we've been doing this survey, the importance of real-world data as a top C-suite issue has actually increased. And the focus on new investments and new platforms, new capabilities, new external partnerships to get access to regulatory-grade real-world data has markedly increased in just the 3 years that we've been doing this survey. So lots of excitement, lots of focus by the industry, both from a regulatory perspective and from an industry perspective.
Thank you. Harmony, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, I think real world evidence is so exciting because it really translates the clinical trial results that we get into something that's much more practical and often tangible and more relevant to practicing clinicians. So as an example, thinking of translating efficacy from a clinical trial into what really becomes real world effectiveness. And it's especially important for us at Beef Healthcare. We're an HIV focused company. And while we do try to design our clinical trials to be representative of our patient population and representative of the real world, we often get questions from physicians asking, okay, things looked great in the clinical trial, but how does that translate to my practice? Is that data going to be relevant for the patient population that I serve, maybe in the geography that I'm living in or the demographic that I represent? So that's really where real world evidence can make a difference, looking to make sure we're addressing those questions that are so relevant to physicians and to patients in terms of translating what we see from our clinical trials into something that's really meaningful.
Thank you. Anne, what about you? I know that Takeda has been actively engaged in the field. What is it that you have been doing?
Well, first of all, thank you, and it's great to be part of this panel. We've been busy. I guess if I touch on two things we've been doing, one is internally. I think the world is now divided pre-pandemic. We're not even post-pandemic yet, but we're pre-pandemic. We had been an active decision about a year ago to really build up our internal expertise in real-world data. We already had a lot, but we took the active decision to build up an enterprise-wide platform, an enterprise-wide approach around real-world data. We'd been quite disparate between R&D and different parts of the enterprise, and really been building that and scaling that capability. But in this dreadful pandemic that we've seen, we've been working with an alliance of pharma through an organization called COVID R&D Alliance. And as part of it's about 20 pharma companies coming together. And as part of that, we've had a data sharing group to include real world data. And so what we realized very early on was, as all of us were designing clinical trials for COVID, but we really didn't have enough data. We really didn't understand the disease. It's hard to design a clinical trial in that case. And so actually real world data filled that gap. And it has been an extraordinary opportunity for real world data to really demonstrate its utility and to really help those of us in different parts of the healthcare ecosystem, being treatment for patients, design a clinical trial, or the patient themselves, how important real world data is and the rigorous process of it.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I would like to remind our audience that we love your questions, and you can submit them via the chat box in the window that you're currently in. Harmony, ViiV recently had a breakthrough announcement for a molecule that is, superior in preventing HIV in people at risk. Did real world evidence help you achieve that well, or do you have any plans to sort of expand your current trials or future trials by using real world evidence? How does that work? Give us a bit of detail if you can.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're referencing the announcement that came out this week about the superiority trial of one of our prevention studies in women in Africa. And that was definitely a breakthrough moment for us. So where real world evidence can play a role, the long-acting injectable that was part of that trial is still very much investigational. So you have to remember, you can't really be doing real world data trials until something is on the market and in the real world. So we haven't been able to do any real world data studies yet in the prevention space with that long-acting. But what we have planned to do, we're also in a treatment space moving to long-acting injectable therapies for HIV. And we have now launched the first ever long-acting injectable regimen for HIV. So if you think about how different this is, how novel this is, moving a field that for 30 years has been treated with pills, daily pills, to something that now is a long-acting injectable, there's a lot that we need to learn and understand about how these therapies get implemented and what the perception is and how they really do operate in the real world. So that's the space we're leaning into now. It's more in the treatment space, looking at long-acting injectables and really trying to understand how are physicians going to implement these in their clinic, what's going to be the perception of patients, what is their quality of life and their perception to these therapies. So that's the areas right now we're exploring related to our long-acting products.
Thank you. Anne, what about you? What about Takeda? Are you currently engaged in any real world evidence research, or are you planning on doing that soon? What's the deal there?
We have real world evidence research going on multiple programs at any one time. I'll give you a particular example in our rare disease space. We are using real world data as a comparator for our clinical trial. So, as most of you know, rare disease trials are very hard to recruit. Patients and parents, it's usually parents, it's very difficult for them to decide to join a clinical trial when there is a placebo arm. That's a very, very difficult decision for a parent. And so what we've been able to negotiate with regulators is that we do a single arm trial, but then we use a contemporaneous control arm using real world data as for the comparison to understand the effectiveness of the drug. And so we've used that for a number of our rare diseases and also a number of our oncology programs. And it has been really only through really good collaboration with the regulatory authorities that we've been able to do this. And I think the key is to bring forward your argument, bring forward robust analysis, and engage in a good discussion with the regulators in order to take this approach.
Thank you. Brett, I would like to ask you, obviously, Anne and Harmony can mostly speak about their companies, but what are you most excited about in terms of, what real world evidence applications or implementations are you most excited about? Is there anything that struck you in recent months or recent years as something that is quite innovative?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So there is definitely a macro trend that we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years since we launched ConvergeHEALTH. And just for context, ConvergeHEALTH is a business unit within Deloitte, specifically that we invested in to help support the secondary analysis of all the digital health data that's floating around, with a big focus, obviously, on real-world data and evidence. And so over the 6.5 years that ConvergeHEALTH has existed, we've seen a macro trend that is very real, where 6 years ago, most of the biopharma that we worked with were investing in real-world data, I would say, in different silos. So the health economics and outcomes research group would make an investment, or the clinical trial ops group would make an investment. We have seen an absolute trend towards what we call end-to-end evidence, really creating enterprise-wide capabilities. And I think, Anne has alluded to some of the things that Takeda is doing. Takeda is doing great work in this space to really start to break down those silos and think about a holistic platform. So there's technology implications. And certainly the move to the cloud has helped create new technology capabilities for analytics and data analysis at an efficient cost point across the various silos that exist. There's certainly governance and data governance and stakeholder management to happen across those different silos. And for good reason, there's regulatory barriers about what can be used by different parts of a biopharmaceutical organization. The other super exciting trend is the need for external collaborations. And Anne alluded to what's going on with COVID. I think COVID has accelerated this trend and the need for it. But the need for pharma to look outside their four walls, to enter into novel collaborations, to get access to real-world data has become super important. And that's because the traditional, I'll put in quotes, real-world data sets that you can license from the data vendors only get you so far. A lot of the new rich real-world data exists with patient advocacy groups, with digital health startups who are capturing novel data in specific disease areas. And that data is not licensable from the big data aggregators who have big claims data sets and other things that have historically been used. So those external partnerships and creating that organizational capability within a biopharma to team is another really exciting area that we've really seen accelerate. And I think, when the history books are written on COVID, that will be one of the lasting implications on that acceleration of need for cross-industry collaborations around real-world data and evidence.
Yeah, that's very interesting. How do we, in all of this, I know the industry is very excited about real-world evidence, but how do we communicate to regulators? How do we convince? How do you plan on convincing regulators that it's a sound way of doing things? And how do you communicate to patients, especially at a time like this, when the reliability of regulators is so important, where vaccine hesitancy might void any efforts to get a vaccine and get out of the pandemic? How do we make sure that the viability of real-world evidence is communicated to both regulators and patients? And have you specifically engaged with any regulators about this already, and what have they been saying? I know you have, and for a certain amount. So why don't you start?
Yes, so thank you. Yes, we have. And actually, I'll go back to COVID for a minute, because actually COVID has opened up, and Brett alluded to, so many doors for collaboration. And we, in pharma, we have had the opportunity to work not just ourselves through the alliance I mentioned, but we also work through our industry body called Pharma, and we've had a number of interactions with the regulators through that. And there's also a number of other initiatives ongoing across the ecosystem that we've participated in. And so I think there is a lot of crosstalk at the minute. And I think you are right, Donato. We need to make sure that everything we're doing is high caliber and high science. And I think by sharing a lot of the protocols, a lot of the methods, a lot of the statistical ways of doing things, I think we're starting to enable that more. To your question about patients, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we are able to articulate that story very well yet. It's something we need to really deliver on for patients. I think the example in rare diseases may be one way that we can do it, but I think it is important that we start to articulate that story to patients much better.
Yeah. Harmony, what about you?
Yeah, so we're actually quite active in this space as well. So the 21st Century Cure Act does mandate where and when real world evidence can be used, certainly to expand label indications, et cetera. So we have very active real world evidence program. We've already submitted supplemental NDAs to expand our label applications based on real world studies that we've done. So we've very much engaged in that. We also have strong collaborations and partnerships, both through some of the pharma consortiums, as well as working closely with the FDA and other regulators, to really work with them and align on what are the quality standards around this that we all need to agree to, because that is still an open question. And the regulators themselves are sort of grappling with this. So we're working closely with them to try to establish that. I think when it comes to platforms that are available, it's been mentioned, but there are certainly some really good platforms out there related to real world data. But depending on what therapy area that you're in, there's also still some gaps. So as an example, we know from an HIV perspective, we have great platforms available where we can look at real world effectiveness, safety, et cetera, adherence of our products. We don't have a robust way to collect information around drug resistance. So that's critically important in HIV. If a patient fails a regimen, to say, did they develop resistance to any of our medicines? That data source is probably the biggest one that's lacking from an HIV perspective. And then I think in terms of translating it to patients, I agree with Anne. I think it's a work in progress. And I think we are starting to make inroads, by asking the questions that patients care about, by talking about things like quality of life and how you can use this information to inform implementation and delivery models. Those kind of things matter to patients. So you just have to be engaging with them, understanding what questions they want answered based on their medicines, and move forward in that direction.
Yeah. Brett, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So in terms of the patient, I think this is vitally important, and I agree with both panelists that it's early days, although we are starting to see the tip of the iceberg, I think, of an exciting convergence trend between patient engagement through new digital health platforms and real world data. And what I mean by that is, there are gaps, and it is very disease dependent in real world data sets that exist. And we're seeing a lot of exciting investment. And I'm on panels like this talking about digital health and new patient engagement models for engaging patients around new therapies. That engagement, though, while it can help with adherence and other important things, also is an opportunity, if the dots are connected, to fill evidence gaps when engaging the patient, to collect data either directly from the patient or increasingly, depending on the disease area, through wearable devices, which can start to really bring the patient closer to the generation of evidence in a real world setting. That is a step forward from sort of data collected in an electronic medical record or a traditional registry. So it's very early days, but that convergence of digital health and new digital health platforms and real world data, I think, is something over the next 5 to 10 years is going to become real in particular areas, especially if organizations that patients trust, like advocacy groups, start to embrace these platforms, and pharma can team with those advocacy groups in novel scientific collaborations. The other area where we're seeing this convergence around the patient, we've talked a little bit about R&D and the FDA and EMA and regulators from that perspective, but is on the reimbursement side. So increasingly, outcomes-based contracts often have a piece of the contract that's around patient experience as something that could be part of the reimbursement paradigm as an outcome in addition to traditional clinical outcomes. And so measuring that patient experience is another way on that reimbursement end of the spectrum to engage patients and understand the value that's being created around the traditional clinical attributes, as well as quality of life attributes, which are increasingly becoming part of that dialogue around reimbursement in some disease areas.
Thank you. Sorry. A reminder to our audience that we're getting a lot of questions, but we definitely want more. So keep asking away. I think the next thing that I would like to ask you, and it's something that I've asked to almost all my panelists so far, is, the pandemic has been extraordinary. We've seen levels of collaboration that we hadn't seen in such a long time. We've also seen levels of political pressure on regulators and companies that we hadn't seen in a very long time, or perhaps ever, to be frank with you. So what is your main takeaway in terms of R&D from this pandemic? What is the one thing that we should take away and sort of apply to the future? And what is the one thing that perhaps didn't work and we shouldn't duplicate? Anne, why don't you start?
So I think the idea that in the world of real world data, the idea that real world data can really inform us about the disease, inform us in real time, what works and what doesn't work. Long before we had declarations of definitive outcomes, different academic bodies, we were already seeing different trends, for instance, in the use of different drugs in COVID, using the real world data. So I think the recognition that real world really inform on a disease and what's happening in ER systems of hospitals, in wards, and treatment of those patients, to me, that's just incredible. We've never really been in that scenario before. And in terms of what didn't work, I talked a bit about the alliance that we've been working in. And I think my biggest learning is even when you've got a real coalition of the willing and you really have everybody really wanting to go, our ecosystem, our processes, our way of working, be it, I don't care which part of the ecosystem you're in, it's not quick enough, it's not good enough, standardized enough, it's not slick enough for us to move as fast as the pandemic needed us to move. We have seen some evidence of that. We have seen fantastic results from a week. We're hoping to see more. So we have seen glimmers of hope. But for the most part, I think we need to look at, and I think Harmony alluded to it, we need to look at things like standardization in the ecosystem and better processes and better ways to do things. Otherwise, even when you really, really want to do something fast, we trip over ourselves.
Harmony, why don't you go next?
Sure, happy to. I agree with everything that Anne said. We learned so much through the COVID pandemic, and for us, it was really leveraging this terrible pandemic in as positive a way possible by challenging ourselves to understand the impact it had on our physicians and our patients. So we were able to, have an RFP process, do a deep dive to try to really understand, do people living with HIV respond to COVID differently, as an example. We were able to create studies like that very quickly in light of this. And we were able to study, again, what's the impact of this from a clinical trial perspective, which we believe will translate when these products get to the real world. So, we knew that a lot of the standard processes and methodologies that we used were going to be challenging in COVID, in terms of making sure sites can get their medications, et cetera. Now, we're really proud of the fact that we were able to get medicine to all the sites, all the patients who needed to. We didn't have a supply chain issue, but that took some creative thinking on our end and some negotiations, with regulators in terms of how we handle deviations to our protocols, how we handle missing data. If a patient can't get into the clinic at their set time during a clinical trial, how do we handle that? Because as you know, many clinics just weren't open for the more routine type of visits during COVID. And then I think finally we learned a lot about what is possible in the field of telemedicine. In the old days, telemedicine was not fully embraced, and I think there was a lot of challenges from a reimbursement perspective and those kind of things. And I think COVID really forced everyone to think differently about that and understand what really could be done in the telemedicine space. And I think that's an area that's going to continue to evolve. I think the one thing we didn't do as well as an industry, as Anne alluded to, is the pace of response. And again, we flexed and became agile and nimble very, very quickly. But when you're facing a pandemic, it's always a question, is it fast enough? Could you have gone even faster? Because there was, definitely a burning platform that has to be addressed.
Yeah. Brett, what about you?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said, so I don't want to be repetitive. I guess I'll make 2 points. One is sort of a macro hope I have for post-pandemic world, which is I hope some of the urgency that we applied collectively as a system, both from a regulatory perspective and industry perspective, a collaboration perspective, all the way down through our healthcare delivery, like telemedicine is now widely adopted. I hope that sense of urgency we don't lose and apply it to other disease areas. I think we can learn that we can move a lot faster if we challenge some of the conventional orthodoxies of why things can't move faster in life sciences and healthcare, and changes. So that's sort of a macro high level ambition. I do think one thing that is a tactical thing that will be a long-term implication is different expectations of patients. I think it starts with just the experience of healthcare and being able to do a lot more virtually. Why do I need to drive down, find challenging parking, sit in a lobby for 45 minutes just to talk to a doctor for 5 minutes? So I think the patient experience and expectations will change. I think that will translate and is already translating into the clinical trials realm, where decentralized clinical trials, where a lot of data can be collected remotely, was already a trend that was sort of happening at healthcare's snail pace of adopting technology. But we're going to see, I think, a very huge acceleration of using new digital platforms to engage patients differently around clinical trials. And obviously, if labs need to be collected and other things, you need to go into the clinic. But there's a lot in many clinical trials that can be collected remotely through engaging patients with some of these new technologies.
Thank you. One last question, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. One thing that I've heard a lot in the past few days is that real-world evidence could actually decrease R&D costs if it's done properly, and it could also mean that we're looking at perhaps downwards pressure on prices and subsequently greater access. Is that true? Do you agree with it? How should we push for a greater transparency when it comes to costs and R&D? Brett, why don't you start with this one?
Yes, I mean, I'll tackle the R&D one. This came out loud and clear in our 2020 real-world real-world evidence survey. And again, the interviews were conducted in January and February, so it was right before the pandemic hit. So there may be some nuances in sort of the pandemic world we're in now. But R&D as the priority focus came out loud and clear. And then what was interesting, we bifurcated the cohort of organizations who had mature real-world data and evidence capabilities, had invested in the platforms, the governance, the end-to-end evidence, breaking down the silos that we talked about earlier, versus those who had not made those more aggressive investments. And within that cohort, which was about 40%, who had invested in more advanced capabilities, they actually were seeing measurable returns already in R&D. And it comes in the form of a couple areas. One, at the front end of the trial, using real-world data to inform trial design, which has downstream implications for recruitment. Because if you design the protocol correctly around patients that actually exist, you can shorten that recruitment cycle, which has obvious efficiency and speed benefits. Anne alluded to this, I think, in one of her examples, where we're seeing synthetic control arms increasingly used with real-world data. So instead of recruiting a control arm, so that obviously has compression on the development life cycle. And then in the IND submissions, we see areas for increased efficiency and impact in terms of using some of the real-world data to complement and supplement some of the submissions. So those are just 3 examples of where organizations that we engaged as part of our survey that had those more advanced capabilities, had made the investments in new analytics and data platforms, had engaged in new external collaborations to get regulatory grade RWD, and then applied that to the R&D cycle. We're actually reporting that they're actually seeing an ROI on that investment across multiple areas, which is exciting to see, because that was the hypothesis of the value that real-world data and evidence would have, and now we're starting to see it actually play out with real examples and real tangible return.
Thank you. Harmony, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I agree, and I won't speak too much more about the R&D piece because I think it was covered really well by Brett. But I think just to build on that quickly, the one other area in R&D where real-world data I think can help to drive down cost is after your initial approvals. There's been some really good, large, pragmatic trials that have come out recently. In our space, the Southward Lung Study is one that's always quoted, but when you start thinking about how could you possibly expand labels, expand patient populations, using more real-world data, large pragmatic trials, as opposed to a classic clinical trial, that can certainly help from a cost perspective. Just a couple of thoughts on your second piece, which was really around increasing access. I think this is where real world data plays a huge role. And again, reflecting from our perspective at ViiV, all of our recent launches have either been, new mechanisms of action or new approaches to how HIV is treated, really trying to challenge, like I said, a 30-year treatment paradigm. And what we've seen is the impact of real world data in terms of expansion in guidelines, building confidence in these new regimens and expanding guidelines can definitely help to open up access. Because we know for many countries around the world, just because something is approved doesn't mean it'll get reimbursed, right? And so having something on a guideline as an example can really help drive reimbursement in countries. And we've definitely seen the impact that real world data can have in that space. And then I think finally pulling in the patient perspective and patient preference can also help in terms of companies getting the reimbursement for their innovation. So I think that's another area where real world data can be incredibly helpful, just really trying to show, again, the impact of new medicines on patients can be very powerful.
Thank you. Anne, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really like the examples that both Brett and Harmony gave, and I'll give one additional example in the access space, which is for every program that we bring forward, our teams are expected to have an evidence generation plan. The idea being that what we generate at our clinical trial should be a robust data set, but perhaps it doesn't have long enough patient follow-up. It doesn't cover out maybe to mortality endpoints if we're looking at oncology. Or it doesn't cover the comparators that we might need to have for different parts of the world. So we use an evidence generation to lay out those activities, be they observational research, be they additional indirect comparison analytics, or different types of work that we might approach. It might be a modeling approach using a systems pharmacology model. Different types of work that together make up an evidence generation plan so that we can make sure that patients in different parts of the globe can obtain access to our medicines.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 7 minutes and a half left. I'm going to move to questions from the audience. The first question is, what is the biggest trap with the interpretation of real world evidence? Brett, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number. I guess one of the, and this is more of an organizational statement that I will make, which is there's sometimes we see a gap within some of our biopharma clients between, I'll call it the hope of senior executives who may not be data scientists or rigorous methodologists in terms of a hope that there's a silver bullet in terms of use of real world data and the reality of what it can actually do today. And that sometimes we've seen creates within an organization some friction and an expectation gap in terms of sort of the hype and promise versus the reality. And it's a shame when we see that, because the reality of it is super exciting, as we've been covering for the last 40 minutes or so. But I think, that's sometimes a gap that we've seen within an organization in terms of truly understanding where the limitations of how real world data and real world evidence can be used.
Mm-hmm. Anne, what are your thoughts?
I actually think there's two limitations. One is our own vision and how we put it forward and what we think we can do. Brett alluded earlier to potentially digital streams being used as real world data. So I think one is our own vision and limitation. And I think the other goes back to methods and ensuring that we distinguish between when we're using real world data, maybe in a commercial space to generate insights, and that can be more exploratory type work, versus using data to maybe in a regulatory space where it needs to be very rigorous and where the methods, the cohorts, the bias, and all the very rigorous aspects need to be taken account of. And I think making sure we're very, very clear about which of those types of analyses we're doing. Mm-hmm. And so whenever we approach regulators or approach payers, that we're able to have a robust, are able to not confuse the issue with bringing forward bad methods, frankly.
Harmony.
Yeah, my view is very similar. You have to be really ruthless about the methodologies and the assumptions that go into these protocols. We've seen in the past, actually, we felt we demonstrated true channeling bias through a real world evidence study, but you have to be really careful because you don't always have the insights, right, about why certain patients are on certain medications. And so, part of it is just understanding the value that you can get from real world data, but being open about the limitations that it's not perfect either. And there will often be, areas or more information that you want to understand and that you just can't. So again, in an HIV setting, we can tell if someone has switched regimens. We may not know why. Is it patient preference? Was it physician preference? What was it linked to? And those kind of things just aren't always obvious when you're looking at a real world data database or cohort. So I think you have to be really ruthless in your methodologies, make sure you're asking the right questions, and make sure whatever database you're querying has the information to appropriately answer that.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to bake the two remaining questions into one. So U.S. regulators seem to be ahead of the curve when it comes to real-world evidence compared to their U.S. counterparts. And the other question from the audience is, what type of data sets are most valuable for pharma when we're discussing real-world data? Brett, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the second question first. I mean, I think the claims data sets are always going to have some level of utility, particularly when understanding sort of the cost element and some of the real-world data analysis in terms of health economic outcomes. But I think increasingly we're seeing sort of purpose-captured real-world data sets through novel disease registries, through new digital health platforms. Electronic medical records, depending on how the data is captured, continue to be spotty in terms of the value that they can provide because the data is not always captured in a way that is useful, since a lot is captured in unstructured notes, but we are making some progress on that front. So I think those richer clinical data sets are increasingly becoming important.
Harmony.
I will say FDA is pretty far advanced in terms of their thinking around real-world data, but we're seeing that among other regulators as well. And if you think about it, there have always been countries, primarily in Asia, I think of Korea and Japan as two classic examples, but often even after primary approval of a drug, they have wanted their own post-marketing studies done, whether it was a post-marketing safety study or a post-marketing efficacy study in that patient population. So if you think about it, that's actually, they're asking for real world data, right? They're asking to say, how does this medicine now translate to my patient population? So I think sometimes it's just, how we define things in today's world or how we frame things. But when I reflect on that, I actually think we've gotten this question from regulators really around the globe for quite some time in terms of making sure the clinical trial data that was submitted is relevant and translates to their country and their population as well.
Thank you.
And maybe just to follow on from Harmony's answer, we've very recently seen guidance coming out from both Japan and China around real world data and from Europe. So I think all regulators are moving forward there, and it's great actually. It's really, really good. In terms of which data sets are most valuable, those with the biggest sample size, those that are the cleanest, and those that have the endpoints that you want for the question at hand. There's no magic bullet about it, but it needs to have the data and the endpoints that you care about with a sufficient sample size to draw conclusions.
Yeah, of course. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This was incredibly interesting. We had Brett Davis, who's the Principal and General Manager of ConvergeHEALTH by Deloitte, Harmony Garges, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Beep Healthcare, and Anne Hetherington, Senior Vice President and Head of Data Science, the Head of Data Sciences Institute with Research and Development at Takeda. Stay with us. Today's the last day of this summit. The next panel coming up will be moderated by Greg Ray, and it will be a conversation with Ulrike Kreiser, who's the Senior Vice President of Healthcare at GS1. Thank you so much for joining us.